So in this episode, I want to talk to you a bit more about the axiomatic truth that says we can't know ourselves through introspection. And I also want to talk to you a bit more about those cultural domains to start to offer you a critique of what you'll find in chapter 2 of our prescribed text on social psychology. Now let's pick out one of those axiomatic truths that operates in psychology. This is in relation to that question as to whether we can know ourselves through introspection. And introspection is that process of self-reflection, where you examine your own mental and emotional state. And mainstream psychology today would say that, on the whole, no, we can't know ourselves through introspection. And psychology didn't used to say that. Way back in its earliest days, it very much believed that introspection was a legitimate way of understanding human behavior. And I've got a video on that called The 7 Ages of Methods in Psychology up on my YouTube channel, and I've put it on our Moodle site as well as bonus content under Teaching Week 3. So these days, mainstream psychology says introspection can't help us understand human behavior. But observation by an independent observer can, preferably done by a trained psychologist, trained in scientific method or in clinical diagnostic practices, techniques, and so on. Now, this is a powerful idea that sits in mainstream psychology, and it's the idea that people are biased when it comes to understanding their own behavior, and that they don't have the expertise to be able to understand themselves, and they would be too subjective in any case. But psychology says more than that. It also says that this bias spills out into how people observe other people. And it's the profession of psychology that you must turn to if you want to either understand yourself or understand other people. Now, you can probably see that psychology has got a bit of skin in the game here. You know, it's got a vested interest in promoting that view. And you can find examples of the way psychology has found our perceptions of ourselves to be biased and wrong in chapter 2. There's lots of examples of it in there. And basically, the text kind of constructs this argument that psychology sort of saves ourselves from our own stupidity because it positions itself as the objective observer of human behavior that can show all of these biases that we all have. And then psychology, through psychologists, can come in and correct those biases and tell us what we truly think and the true reasons why we behave in the way we do. Some of that work is really persuasive, and you might have found yourself, drawn into it. And psychology, on the whole, has claimed that these achievements, its insight into human behavior, haven't come from introspection, but they've come from experimental methods, from experimental and observational work where psychologists place a social distance between themselves and those they study. So they become disinterested, neutral observers who scientifically observe human behavior. And the more distance you can place between you and the observer, and between the observer and the thing you're observing, the better. It's as though you can only observe the human condition when you are distant from it. Now, the first problem with this is that it's never possible to take yourself out of the human condition. You can't put distance between yourself and the human condition. Everyone who observes is also observed. We're the actor and the acted upon. We're both subject and object at the same time. And even if you could escape the human condition, when you observe human behavior, your observations will be used by other humans for interests that serve them. Now, think about that part in chapter 2. So have a read of chapter 2, and you'll find a part in there which recounts how people who are paid money for their work don't necessarily work better than those who aren't paid money for their work. Now, can you think of whose interest might be served by that gem of a finding? It's not a neutral observation. It becomes instantly politicized the moment the observation is made. There's no such thing as an objective observation of human behavior. Now, in our prescribed text, you also get some material on culture. And here, the vehicle to talk about culture is that distinction between individualistic and collectivist cultures. And we're going to pick that up some more in a future video. But let's pick up a bit of that here and talk some more about those cultural domains. Our concept of self in individualistic cultures is one of an independent, autonomous, self-contained unit. To present ourselves in the best light to the world, we need to show how individual we are, how unique we are. And this can be expressed in our clothing or other aspects of our appearance or our personality and so on. The individual self becomes a project to work on. We work towards self-improvement to become the best version of ourselves, and we become proud of ourselves, which are very odd things to say in anywhere other than in a highly individualistic culture. Those sound silly unless you've really bought into individualism. Individualistic cultures are those found in Australia, in the UK, Western Europe, and the US. Now, in a collectivist culture, the self is not seen as independent from others, but as interdependent on others. Your sense of self is tied to your social group, such as your family or your community. And collectivist cultures are those found in such places as Central and South America, Southern Europe, Asia, parts of Africa. But be careful. Be careful with this binary. In Australia, we've got the longest surviving human culture on the planet, the culture of First Nations people. And that's largely a collectivist culture. Even though it's not dominant, it's there. But it's also not that useful to think of these things in binaries, of being either individualistic or collectivist. Even among individualistic cultures, you find the expression of collectivist behaviors, such as the strength of the workers' union movement and other social movements. Those global movements, global social movements, are an example of that collectivism among people. Even for those people who live in primarily individualistic cultures, people are part of global social movements. So more often, we find no simple way of defining people as either collectivist or individualistic. It's best perhaps to think of it in terms of a balance between the two, with some cultures being imbalanced in terms of overemphasizing one over the other, and where one is more reflected in the mainstream social institutions, such as the legal system, the educational system, the mass media, and so on. And it's really in how those mainstream social institutions work that we find that imbalance between individualism and collectivism. Now let's look at the institution of education to show an example of this. Now think about your university experience. Have you ever noticed how much you're expected to do individual work? Well, that's because universities in the West are built upon the model of the autonomous worker. Even when you undertake group work, you're required to submit individually produced assignments. And where you do work with others, you risk being disciplined because of this thing called plagiarism. Plagiarism is actually only a thing in cultures that see knowledge as normally a thing that's owned by individuals. Plagiarism is really common, is a concept that's common in individualistic societies where things can belong to individuals rather than things belonging to the collective. And this is why you've got to follow those particular rules on your university course about citing other people's work, referencing the other people's work, because they own it. You don't own it, they own it. And in a collectivist culture, you're less likely to find that norm of individuals owning knowledge. Knowledge is more typically seen as belonging to everyone, and plagiarism becomes an odd concept. And sometimes plagiarism doesn't mean anything in some of these collectivist cultures. Individualism also has a particular dominance in the psychology that most students study in Australia, because psychology is another social institution and it's dominated by individualism. And it's also because the psychology that most students study in Australia comes from the US and Western Europe, and most of that work is built on individualistic assumptions. It's built on that concept of the self that's autonomous and independent of others. But the social institutions in these countries go broader than that. It's almost like a whole-scale adoption of individualism as a normative practice. Everything is seen through that lens of individualism, that psychology only understands human behavior through focusing on the individual. But how did we get to this point of individualism becoming so dominant in these countries? Well, I've got an answer. Kind of. It was my generation, Generation X, that fully embraced individualism. Prior generations to mine in the US, the UK, and in Australia were individualistic, but had a much stronger sense of collectivism running through their veins. And the generation prior to mine was known as the baby boomers, people born between the mid-1940s and mid-1960s. The name refers to the dramatic increase in the birth rate that happened at the end of World War II. And during World War II, collectivism took hold in Western Europe, the UK, and the US, and was reflected in the dominance of Keynesian economics, where the focus was on increasing the role of government in managing the economy, largely through programs of structural spending on things like education, welfare services, health services, and infrastructure. And it was the time of big government. Government would look after us all. The collective was more important than the individual. And collectivism became pronounced during the First and Second World Wars, because when your country is fighting a common enemy, in this instance the Nazis, you need the population to unite, to work together. And to do that, you need to reshape society and reshape the way social institutions work so that people are more likely to come together and work together. And a key part of that reshaping is through the economic system, not just through Keynesian economics, but through systems of taxation. So you change the system of taxation such that wealth is more evenly distributed. The rich are asked to pay more taxes, the poor pay less taxes, and you reduce the social inequalities that exist. And that's a key mechanism to get different sectors of society to unite, to work together for a common cause. We kind of sort of saw a bit of this starting to happen during the worst years of the COVID epidemic, when people were fighting the common enemy, in this case, the deadly virus. But there weren't those wholesale structural changes to our social institutions, and our taxation system largely stayed the same. And, after the worst years of COVID, people carried on with their kind of individual way of living. Individualism didn't really have much of a disruption from COVID, or any disruption that happened was temporary. Now, that generation of baby boomers were followed by my generation, born in the mid-1960s to early 1980s. And my generation were born at a time when neoliberalism displaced Keynesian economics, and neoliberalism became globally dominant. And that happened around the early 1970s, early 1970s. Neoliberalism is a political ideology characterized by heightened individualism. So neoliberalism is about free trade, about cut and regulation, and about small government, about people looking after themselves rather than government looking after people for them. It's about the individual, not about the collective. So it's about individuals working in their own self-interest, and that was the way that was seen to promote economic growth, and that's still the model today. And it was the birth of consumer capitalism during the 1970s when that became rampant. By the time the generation after mine arrived, Generation Y, we were fully immersed in neoliberalism and consumer capitalism, and Western societies had fully pivoted towards individualism. Now, it's actually quite difficult for people of my generation, but more so for the generation that followed mine, to think of an alternative to the system we have now, to think of an alternative to capitalism or to neoliberalism. And that's described as the point at which the system has become hegemonic, which is this where we're at now. And hegemony just means that it's when you can't imagine an alternative to the way things are. And this is where critical social psychology comes in, to help us critique that hegemony, that dominant system, and to help us reimagine an alternative to it. Now, it's said that the generations that came after the baby boomers became more individualistic, self-obsessed, narcissistic, just interested in themselves and not interested in the collective. But there are signs that things are changing, that the generation after the millennials, the next generation, I think Generation Z, we call them, that they might be showing greater signs of collectivism. Oh, you might be in Generation Z. I forget that. But quite a few of our classmates are in that generation. And they're showing some more signs of collectivism, largely because of the collective catastrophe that my generation and the baby boomers has left everyone, namely the climate emergency. So now we're all facing peril, this threat of annihilation, that people are coming together. And they're coming together to fight another common enemy. In this instance, fighting the causes of climate change. So things are shifting, and that is helping us in terms of critical social psychology because it helps open up the cracks in the existing system. And it helps us open up the cracks that are appearing in psychology because people are questioning this individualistic approach in psychology. And they're imagining how psychology might be different in the future, along with imagining a different future for all of us. So some big stuff there, big picture stuff that I've just given you. And it's the broader context, really, for you to help you understand why this unit's here and why this unit is tapping into those terms, those things about the broader culture and broader political landscape around us. So it's quite a heavy going. I'm sorry about that, and it's a long video, so we should end now. I'll end this video now. So I'll see you in the next one, I hope. So till then, ta-da.